you speak. He's come in and done this for several years, but he's moving on to different journey in his life. We have a new superintendent coming in, but he was embedded, I guess, with the South Vietnamese as an advisor, learned the language very, very fluently, worked with the South Vietnamese people. And we've asked each one of them to tell their stories for maybe 25 minutes or 30 minutes. And if you have a question you'd like to ask, maybe write it down as you go, and we will open up the last 45 minutes, half an hour, whatever it turns out to be, to your questions that you may address to any one or all of them.
Well, I just, when you ask your questions, make sure you boom out with your loudest voice, and so we can pick it up on the microphone. Yeah, I guess that's one of the things. And as some of you are with Mr. Brown's class, and he's asked me to collect notes for his students, and I'll be standing over to your right at the end of this session. Okay, so listen to what these people have to say, and then ask your questions. I love this forum, and I look forward to it each year, because even though I've heard these three people speak several times, I learned something new. And for me as a teacher, it's exciting for them to be in front of you, our students, and for you to listen to them and then ask them questions.
And
those of you seated who just come in, could you guys move over to the
preferred order, so we'd like to know.
Because we don't have a PA system. Thank you.
Okay. Everybody gets situated.
That's it.
And this is the only mic that you seem to come up with, so I think it's directional enough that you should be able to pick up just from where you are. If you'd like to stand up.
Oh,
Yeah, be the leadoff hitter.
okay. Well, good evening, and thanks for giving us this opportunity to be with you tonight. As Dr. Perry said, we've done this before, but it's always refreshing to do it, and it's amazing how quickly the year goes by. And we only see each other about once a year, so it's kind of a reunion for us. Now, this evening, each of us will tell you a little bit different story. Marianne will be fascinating because she was in the medical profession in Vietnam, and also she was a woman serving in Vietnam, which is really a distinction. Steve was an infantryman who was seriously wounded, and his story is awe-inspiring. And when you hear him speak, you will realize how strong the human spirit is to have survived and overcome what he did and be the person he is today. My experience is that I was a career Marine. That was my job. That's what I did for a living for 29 years. So the Vietnam War was just one of many wars that I fought in. So my perspective is a little bit different. And as a career person, I didn't have to be there. It was just what I chose to do for a living. I was there 3 times. First, early on before the war really picked up big time as a lieutenant. I was back in the 67, 68 time frame, which was a very intense time of the war as a captain. And I was back in the 73 time frame when I was a major and we were coming out of Vietnam. I'll speak primarily about my second time there when I was a captain. We had, the U.S. had combat advisors with all of the Vietnamese combat units. And as a Marine, when you're not as an advisor, you're not the second time because you had to have some experience being there the first time in the war. Prior to going out, we all learned the language. When I went out to my unit, and my unit was up in the northern part of South Vietnam, we went from the demilitarized zone down to just north of Da Nang. And I was the only American with my unit for an entire year. I lived with them, fought with them. I wore the uniform, ate their food. When I was wounded, they took care of me for the first couple of days before I was evacuated. The term that we used to describe the advisor and the person whom he was advising was counterpart. In other words, my counterpart was the commanding officer of the unit, and I was his counterpart. To give you an idea of the intensity of it, during the 1 year, I had 4 counterparts. The first 3 were killed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Vietnamese and what it was like being with them and their role in the war. I would say to you that it's important to recognize what it cost the Vietnamese during that war. On the wall in Washington, the Vietnam Wall, there are 58,000 plus names on it, U.S. names on it. There are hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese who were killed the same way, who were not recognized as part of it. Recently, I was asked to participate in a television series with the Discovery Channel about the Battle for Hue City, which was one of the bigger battles during the war. And I agreed to do it. And prior to doing the production, they asked me if I would review a couple of books, and 2 in particular. So the day that we were going to do the filming, the director asked me what I thought of the books. I said, not very much. And he asked me why, and I said, well, one book was to exaggerate the Marine Corps' role at the expense of the Army. The other book was to exaggerate the Army's role at the expense of the Marine Corps, and both books ignored the Vietnamese. And that's my point to you right now. As students studying the Vietnam War, be sure you study it. Study the facts. Get beyond the emotion, get beyond the human interest, and get beyond the myths. And there are 2 questions you should be thinking about primarily as a student of the war. Number 1, ask yourself the question, why were we there? Number 2, ask yourself the question, why did we choose to fight the war the way we did? There are 2 very important questions. And also do your research. Now tonight you'll hear from 3 of us, and you'll hear 3 different stories. Be careful not to generalize, which many Americans do about many things, including the Vietnam War. Don't generalize. Do your research and figure it out. For example, there are a lot of myths about the Vietnam War. And let me just kind of point out a couple of them to you. And I do it not to dazzle you with facts about the war, but just to point out some of the myths that kind of perpetuate themselves. During the Vietnam War, during the 11 years that we consider the time of the war, there were approximately 9 million personnel in U.S. uniforms. About 2.7 served in Vietnam. You will hear that it was mostly the poor, the young, and the uneducated who fought the war. Two-thirds of the Vietnam veterans volunteered. 1/3 was drafted. It was the exact opposite for World War II. World War II, 2/3 were drafted, 1/3 volunteered. The average age in Vietnam was about 23 years of age. The average age of the person killed was about 22 years of age. 87% of those killed were Caucasian, so about 12% African American, which pretty much represented about the population at the time and also the population in the armed forces at the time. 79% of the Vietnam veterans have a high school education or greater. So be careful of those myths that you hear so much about. You hear that the Vietnam veteran has a high rate of suicide and drug use. Not true compared to the American population. Pretty much the same. The average income of the American veteran, Vietnam veteran, is 18% higher than his or her counterparts who did not serve in Vietnam. 97% of all the people who served in the military during the Vietnam War were honorably discharged. 92% said they were proud that they served in Vietnam. 79% said even though they knew the outcome of the war, they would do it again. the vast majority of the American population, bordering on close to 90%, have high respect for the men and women who fought during the Vietnam War. So I tell you these things just to make sure that it kind of set the framework for you as students to realize that you must do your own research about the Vietnam War and be very careful about coming to a conclusion based upon something you read or see. It is my personal belief that we will not get a good historical understanding of the Vietnam War until we have a generation of researchers and historians and writers who were not alive during the Vietnam War. Because there's so much emotion attached to the war that, as I was telling this producer of this television show that I was on recently, that too many people who do research do what I call reverse research. They have a conclusion, and they look for facts to support that conclusion instead of doing it the other way around. So tonight will be your opportunity to hear from us about our experiences and what it was like for us to be there. And I look forward to hearing Marianne and Steve one more time, and then also we look forward to taking your questions.
Well, thank you for having me back again. It's a distinct pleasure to be here. I'll start off by telling you that I went to visit with my mother today. My mother died 2 months ago. And I went to the cemetery. And the cemetery where she's buried is Tahoma National Cemetery. And I stood there and I saw the flags placed along all the tombstones, knowing that she would be immensely proud of this. Because when we hear the word woman and veteran, we don't oftentimes connect the two meaningfully. My mother was intensely proud that she was a veteran. More often than not, what we hear from people is, well, why is your mother buried there? Is your dad buried there and that's why? And I said, no, my mother was a veteran in her own right. And so, because she was so intensely proud of that, she wanted to be buried in the National Cemetery. She was so intensely proud of that, that was one of her last wishes. She was also a child of the Depression, and so she knew it would cost my family less to bury her if she was buried there, but that's a side note. Ever practical my mother was. She was also very intensely proud of me for being a veteran, because both my parents were World War II veterans, but I am the only one in my family who served in an overseas theater of war. Both of my parents were stationed in the United States during the war. And in fact, I know how intensely proud my mother was of me because in her last hospital stay, 2 days before she died, she was telling every nurse who came into her room that her daughter had served as a nurse in Vietnam. It's a wonderful last memory that I have of my mom. But there's also a practical side to that as well. She knew that they would give me the straight information and that I'd be able to tell her what was going on. So, ever the practical woman, my mother. So, it is with some degree of pride that I come to talk to you tonight, because not only was my mother proud of me, but she also recognized that of all the wars that we have fought, women have played an active role. But women are the largest population of veterans who are routinely ignored in the official histories. And so tonight I'm coming to you as a personal representative of the approximately 7,500 women who served on active duty in the Vietnam War. Bless you. Most of us served as nurses in the Army, Navy, and Air Force Nurse Corps. There were also about 35,000 civilian women who served in Vietnam in a whole variety of capacities with the Red Cross, with the USO, as secretaries to generals, as secretaries in the embassies, as secretaries in the construction firms, and in every other kind of capacity almost that you can imagine. They were spies, they were weather people, they were motor pool sergeants. They worked in a variety of capacities, but the majority, between 92 and 98% of all the women in the military who served in Vietnam did so in the nurse corps. The largest percentage of nurses in Vietnam served in the Army Nurse Corps. 80% of the nurses in Vietnam were in the Army, and I was one of those. And I was very much like the majority of those women who came into the military through a need to finish nursing school. The military had a program called the Army Student Nurse Program. And they gave you a year's tuition assistance, room and board, textbook support, and so forth, in return for 2 to 3 years of active duty military service. And as my parents had divorced midway through my nursing school, I decided I had a choice. I was going to drop out of school and work for a year and hopefully come back and complete my education, or graduate with a class that I loved, people with whom I still have very close relationships today, and join the Army. Well, I had not planned to join the Army. I was going to join the Navy. I had a love of the service, even though I didn't grow up in it. My dad transferred from the Navy to the Air Force after World War II and retired from that service, so I grew up as an Air Force brat. And I wanted to join the Navy. Well, the Navy had stopped their program, and so the Army said, "We got money, we need nurses," and so I joined. Of all the nurses who went to Vietnam, 2/3 of them volunteered to do so. And they did so out of a feeling of patriotism. This is, after all, the generation who grew up hearing John Kennedy's inaugural address and felt that, in response to public service announcements, that there was a very strong need for nurses in Vietnam. And even though Congress routinely threatened to draft nurses, they never did, even though they were always short of nurses. 2/3 of us volunteered to go. Some of us volunteered in the hopes of keeping our brothers from having to go to Vietnam, because the military had a policy that siblings couldn't serve at the same time in a war zone. And so many nurses, believing that they would be safe or safer than their brothers, volunteered to go to Vietnam. And many of them actually were successful in keeping their brothers from going. The medical evacuation system in Vietnam was set up so that a wounded American or Allied soldier would be no more than 30 minutes from the nearest hospital by either helicopter or ambulance. And to meet that goal, the Army operated 27 hospitals in Vietnam, in all regions of the country. The Air Force operated 3 casualty staging facilities, and the Navy operated 2 hospital ships in the South China Sea, the Sanctuary and the Repose, and 1 land-based hospital at Da Nang. The first-line medical care given to any wounded soldier was the platoon medic. This is the individual who did immediate life-saving care, and then the radio operator, and Steve will tell you all about radio operators, would call to the nearest dust-off unit, which is the helicopter service that took our patients out of a combat zone to the hospital. And while in the air, then the pilot or co-pilot would radio to the nearest hospital to tell us how many patients were coming, what kind of patients we had, that is, what kind of wounds there were. And then by the time the patients arrived in the hospital, we had a team of physicians and nurses ready to care for them. Even though most of us were doing a 2 or 3 year commitment for service in payment for nursing's education, the survival rate for patients in Vietnam was 99%. This is a phenomenally high number given the severity of wounds of our patients. Vietnam is the war, just in case you're on Jeopardy and need to know this, Vietnam is the war that has the highest percentage of traumatic amputations, multiple traumatic amputations of any war. Although if Iraq keeps going on, we may have a rival for that distinction, if such it is. So we were dealing with wounds the likes of which none of us had ever seen. We were dealing with extreme infections because our patients came in after having been in rice paddies, in rivers, in dirty jungle environments full of Agent Orange and dirt and filth and insects in their wounds. And we treated them with massive doses of antibiotics, fluids, a few days of rest, and a few days after the initial surgery, they would go back to the operating room to have the surgeons surgically clean their wounds. And then about 2 days, 3 days later, they would be evacuated from our hospital to the casualty staging facilities that the Air Force operated. These were kind of like large warehouse-like rooms, and the Air Force nurses cared for them overnight, and the next morning then they would go be evacuated on the hospital planes to Okinawa, usually to Japan, and occasionally to the United States. So we routinely had our patients for no more than 3 to 5 days. And so most of us never knew what happened to any of our patients. We treated any and all patients who came to us. Our first priority obviously was American servicemen of all branches of the military. But we also treated all of our Allied soldiers, which meant despite language barriers, we treated Thais and Koreans and Vietnamese soldiers. We treated Australians, and sometimes there's a language barrier there too. We also treated Vietnamese prisoners of war, and we treated Vietnamese civilians because their going to their own civilian hospitals was literally a sentence of death. They were rat and roach infested. No medical personnel were there to care for patients at night because the VC would come in and kill them. And so we cared for any and all patients who came to us if we had the bed capacity to do so. We worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, and usually that was more if we had mass casualties coming into the hospital. We wore fatigues and combat boots as our standard uniform, the best uniform I ever wore, the most comfortable uniform I ever wore. But it was also very practical because we didn't have clean water and we didn't have washing machines. And the women from the village who thought they were getting an exorbitant amount of money to do our laundry, we actually thought we were paying them a pittance, would wash our clothing on the concrete floor of our shower and hang our fatigues on the wire outside the nurses' quarters to dry. And fatigues were really good because they didn't show the dirt and they didn't hold stains, and so they actually had some semblance of being clean when we wore them. Most of us worked longer hours than we had to because we had a compelling need to help, to do whatever we could. And one of those compelling needs was to go to the emergency room when there were mass casualties. That is, when there were more casualties than the staff in the emergency room could routinely handle. Because all patients came through the emergency room, and then to X-ray, and to the operating room, and then to the wards. I worked in intensive care, surgical intensive care, and so had a very intense first 8 months in the hospital where I was stationed, and then I served as head nurse of 2 surgical wards thereafter. It was kind of my break before coming home, so to speak. One of the most intensely personal and intensely disturbing experiences occurred when I went in to serve during a mass casualty. Now, everybody wanted to help during these instances, and so what happened was everybody would come from everywhere to help, and as a consequence, the emergency room staff spent more time telling people where things were than actually taking care of patients. And so they trained a group of us specifically to work in those situations so that we would know where things were and were able to help. So I got called, because we were on call 24 hours a day, I got called in the middle of my day shift, which was 7 to 7, and I went into the emergency room to find 2 of our best surgeons working on a man in a scene straight out of ER, the television program. They had cracked open this huge man's chest. He must have been 6'4", muscular, just a huge specimen, should have been playing pro football. And they were unsuccessful in getting his heart started, and he died there as we worked feverishly to save his life. And I don't know his name, because when I looked down at his name tag, which is one of the things that the medic always attached to the patient, it said GI number, I don't remember what it was, 20. Now, we took great pride in never numbering GIs. We always wanted their names. We used to make jokes about the Tice, because we used to make jokes about them walking through the minefields holding hands, because we always got the ties in multiples of 5, 10, 20 into our hospital. And we always had RTA, Royal Thai Army, number so-and-so, because their names were so long they wouldn't fit on the armbands around their wrists, and we couldn't pronounce their names anyway. So they were always numbers to us. No GI was ever a number until that day when I walked into the emergency room. And why was he a number? No dog tags. That was an absolute no-no. He was a number because we were in a place that the President of the United States had just told the American people we didn't have troops. And so he died there, an unknown GI to me and to those of us who tried to work on him to save his life. And so when I go to the wall in Washington, D.C., I don't have a name to put to that healthy young body who should have been playing pro football and entertaining us on Sunday mornings. Our reception upon turning home was the same as that as the men. We had bottles and cans and rotten fruit thrown at us. We were spat upon. Nurses were told, you know, if you guys had refused to go to war, they couldn't have had a war. And most of us were so fragile when we came home, we believed it. We don't believe that, of course, now. 10 nurses died in Vietnam. 8 of them were women. And the Public Relations Office for the military decided that it would be too traumatic for the American public to learn that women had died in Vietnam. And so those names were never released to the American public as the names of every GI was. Every night on the 6 o'clock news, instead of running the credits, you know, who the director is and the writer and so forth, they would write on there the names of everybody who had died in Vietnam that day, except for the women. The women's names are, however, on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which is a story in and of itself that I'll just very briefly mention to you. There are 58-some thousand names, as Jim told you, on that memorial, and the names of the women who died in Vietnam are there. You won't find them unless you know their names and ask the ranger to point them out to you, because they're listed in amongst the men they tried to save, because they were all nurses. And that is perhaps appropriate. But there's a lot of controversy about this memorial, not the least of which is if a soldier died in Japan or in the United States of wounds received in Vietnam, his name is not on that wall. Political ploy, we believe, to keep the numbers lower than what they actually were. In response to this memorial, there was a multimillionaire who didn't like it. He didn't like it, one, because it didn't meet his idea of what a memorial should look like, and he didn't like it because it was designed by a woman that he described in a national press conference as an egg roll. Maya Lin is a young woman of Chinese-American descent who designed the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. She has gone on to make a name for herself far and above what that multimillionaire could have imagined. But the memorial is beloved. It is exceedingly powerful. But this multimillionaire struck a deal with the designer, with the committee that was putting this memorial together, to put up a statue that he thought was more fitting. And the statue was of 3 men, which was fine, except that there was a gender missing in the statue. And we young women of the 60s were mightily ticked off that we were omitted from the statue. I've met American men who served in Vietnam that didn't have a clue that women served there. So how can we blame the American public for not knowing that women were in Vietnam? And the answer is we can't. And so we petitioned to have a statue of our own at the opposite end of the memorial. And we had a particular statue designed, and we went all over the country raising money for it. And when we went to the Fine Arts Commission, H. Carter Brown said, no, it doesn't tell a story. We're not going to have a statue up of a woman anywhere in Washington, D.C. if I have anything to say about it, because if you put a statue up of a woman, the next thing you know, the Canine Corps is going to want one too. That was a quote that he made and subsequently denied making when it was aired on 60 Minutes. I tuned in the next week just to see if he responded, and he did. Well, it was signed into law. Congress passed a law that, yeah, there would be a women's memorial. So we had a design competition, and there is now a women's memorial. A statue of 3 women, and one of whom is cradling a wounded soldier in her arms. Bit melodramatic and totally unnecessary, but so too is the statue of the 3 men. The memorial stands by itself as an exceedingly powerful memorial to this war, both symbolically and realistically. For most women, Vietnam was a year unparalleled in their lives. It is a year by which other experiences and other life events are compared and found wanting. It was, for most of us, the best year of our lives. And for the same professional, economic, social, and you name it reasons, it was also the absolute worst year of our lives. But most of us remember it with pride, and like my mom, are very fiercely proud of having served there. Even as bad as our morale got at times, we knew, irrespective of that, that we were doing something good. We were saving lives. And that's what most of us choose to remember. We saw a depth of love and compassion and caring from one human to another that most of us have never seen equaled for the rest of our lives. Thank you.
I'm always very touched by the speakers before me because we all have something in common. One, we like each other, and also our jobs and our experiences intertwined. Jim didn't tell you, he was a combat officer in Vietnam, and his radio operator was named Steve. I was a radio operator named Steve, and the officer I carried a radio for was named Jim. Both of our guys died. So it's a pretty emotional thing. The other thing that's emotional for me is that I was wounded on May 18th, so this is an anniversary period for me. If you know anything about trauma, their anniversary periods tend to be a very difficult time for people who have been traumatized. So it's a difficult time for me. The other thing that I would say also is that I spent a whole lot more time with nurses than I did with soldiers in Vietnam. And I have great respect for the nurses, both in Vietnam and stateside, as well as the medics and the chopper pilots and the officers. And a lot of infantrymen had issues with the officers. I didn't. I lived with them. I carried a radio for one. We set up camp every night together in the booties and got to know people and got to know who they were. I had a lot of respect for them. But I'll take you back a little bit to how I got into the military. One, I was drafted. I'm the 1/3 that got drafted. My brother had been to Vietnam, who was 2 years older than me, and he had volunteered for Vietnam and come back very disillusioned and had wanted to be a career in military, as my father was. And my father was an officer in the military and had been in the Philippines, and he had just been finishing his tour in 1941 on December 8th when the Japanese hit Manila, and he was captured and was in the Bataan Death March and was a prisoner of war at Cabanatuan for 3 years. They just showed a film on television the other night called The Great Raid, and my father was liberated by those Rangers that are depicted in that film. So I grew up with a very patriotic family. I was let's say, a guy that was trying to avoid the draft, had long hair, was a surfer. I'm from Santa Barbara. And my father was worried about me. So you young people who are, your parents are worried about, my parents were worried about me. I didn't want to go in the military for a lot of reasons, but one was I didn't really believe what we were doing was right in Vietnam, but really the true reason was I didn't want to go. I didn't want to get shot at, and I didn't want to shoot other human beings. But the choices came down to at that time were that I could go to jail, leave the country, pretend I was gay, or shoot myself or something, or maim myself. And none of those were options that I could accept as to who I was. Although I was making some attempt not to go by not showing up. I thought, well, maybe they'll forget about me or whatever. I get my draft notice to show up, and I just didn't get there. And the letters got angrier and started being signed with little FBI things are going to call you and things like that. And so I started to get pretty nervous. This was over a period of about 3 or 4 months. And I thought, this is 1968. And Jim mentioned that was a very difficult time in Vietnam. It was really the worst combat, 68, 69, the most casualties. And I was really struggling with myself, what was going on. I was 19 years old, and I was watching television and watched Robert Kennedy be murdered on television, and he was the peace candidate, and I kind of hoped that maybe if he won, then I'd go ahead and go in the military, and then he said he'd pull us out. Maybe by the time I got to go to Vietnam, it maybe be over. And so I was sort of stalling, because I really wasn't going to go to jail or fight with the FBI or any of that kind of stuff. That was really not who I was. After seeing Robert Kennedy murdered, I showed up for the draft. It was essentially it was a staging station in San Francisco, and there was all kinds of protests against the war going on. And I walked through those protest lines and got on a bus and came up here to Fort Lewis, a place I said I'd never go again in my life, but I broke that vow when I decided that the PX had good deals. And I was a little older and making different judgments, but I went to basic training and what was called advanced infantry training at Fort Lewis. And I have to tell you something about what the country was like then. It's sort of like it is now. Not really, it was a much more emotional time than it is now, but the people are real split and polarized like they are now about this war. I think it's more intense than it is now, but certainly polarized where you're either for it or against it. And the leadership now, just as then, sort of fed that. And so there was a split, and there were bumper stickers around that time as like, America, love it or leave it. And that was the kind of thing, or peace signs on other people's cars. So there was like this real split amongst American people, amongst families and all. And you know, it's still a really emotional thing. It's still a really emotional thing about the war. And as Jim said, you should make up your own decision on it. You have the opportunity to study and read different books and hear from different folks, make up your mind about it. But I'll tell you, people who live through it are still really intense. Following my, go ahead, I'll jump forward me too. I had a career as I went to college and I came out and I eventually became a therapist and worked with post-traumatic stress disorder. That's people who have been wounded emotionally, psychologically by war and need help overcoming symptoms related to trauma. Well, because I was doing that kind of work, I was associated with the war all my whole life in some way. And I'll tell you, all these years still, when I've spoken to different groups and so on, people our age and from our generation and in that generation are still really emotional about it. I've talked to groups that were like peace groups, and they get really intense. So they start arguing with each other about who stopped the war and all this kind of stuff, and they get really intense. People argue with each other and fight with each other still, all these years later. Well, now they got a little something going on that's starting to look a lot like Vietnam, so in many ways. So there's some intensity still about that. So essentially now I'm take you back to where me going to, because I want to tell you a little bit about getting wounded. I think you need to know about that. And I also want to tell you what I carried with me in Vietnam. And what I carried with me physically, I carried a radio. And they were pretty heavy, about 25, 30 pounds, is that right? I just remember it being heavy. You probably carried it once in a while, right? That was this box thing, and they had it in Korea, I think World War II. It's PRC 30... 25. I can't remember all these things. At first I thought people aren't going to believe I'm a vet because I had like amnesia after the war. I used to have to deal with the phonetic alphabet all the time, alpha, beta, Charlie, delta, echo, etc. I couldn't remember that for a long time. I had this sort of blackout after the war. I think it was my inner self trying to protect me from the pain I was feeling emotionally. Anyway, I carried a radio and I carried an extra battery. An extra battery was in a plastic bag. And plastic bags were important in Vietnam, and if you're out in the jungle, because they kept things sort of dry. So people would always come to me and they'd want my plastic bag so they could put their letters in it and stuff like that. So plastic bags were a big commodity. I also carried food. I carried canned food, And my father sent me a lot of food. My father was a manager of a grocery store, and he sent me a lot of like canned food and stuff. And everybody's eating C-rations, and I'd be eating like these deluxe canned food. What I would never eat now, but there it was like a luxury, you know. I don't want to say names of anything because there's cameras in here, but Denny Moore beef stew, like Nally chili. Maybe I'll get an endorsement opportunity. I ate that kind of food, and people are like really jealous of me. And I always carried extra food. And then when people run out of food, they start looking at me a lot, you know, like, he's got food. Sometimes we couldn't get food because we get socked in by rain and fog and everything. I operated in a unit that worked in a place called the Asha Valley, and it was in the mountains, and it was cold and rainy a lot. And so it's a lot of Vietnam vets talk about being real hot and warm and hot sun in Vietnam. I talk about being the coldest I've ever been in my life and wet all the time, and up in the mountains. And they're not real high mountains, more like what we would call foothills. But I also carried bandages, and because there weren't always medics around, and then actually, as it turned out, I became a medic on Hamburger Hill. I carried a bandolier of cartridges for M16. I carried an M16 rifle. I carried a canteen of water. I carried, well, there's a whole lot of other things. Well, we carried insect repellent that was, I mean, I'll tell you, that was remarkable. This stuff would kill, I mean, jungle spiders and jungle mosquitoes were enormous, but this stuff would, well, you just put it on your body and it would, you know, it was intense stuff. But you had to watch where it landed. I carried pictures of people in my family, and they told me to carry a picture of myself, and I think that was because in case you were wounded so badly you couldn't be recognized or something. I don't know what. I never understood that, but I had to carry a picture of myself. So I chose this picture of me surfing on a beach, sitting on the beach. Because I also wanted to remind myself of who I really was. I also carried a hunting knife, and this radio would catch on these vines we used to call wait a minute vines, and wait a second vines, wait a minute, wait an hour vines, and we'd cut them off of me, because we were going through the jungle, that the radio would grab these things, and I'd be just like humping through the boonies, and whack, I'd stop, and I was like falling backwards, and something would go around me, and I'd pull the knife out, cut it off, or somebody would cut it off from behind me, and I'd move forward. But I carried a Bowie knife, and I carried a whetstone, and I kept it real sharp. And carried a pen and some writing paper. I had a watch, a Timex watch, and it had a luminescent dial on it. And I also carried sadness, and I carried anger, and I carried guilt, and I carried fear, and I carried love, and I carried humor. I carried all those things with me too. That's a lot to carry when you're 20 years old and you're fighting in a war. I want to tell you how I got wounded, and we were in a battle. I'd been in Vietnam for 6 months. I was on what we called Hump Day. Hump Day was the first day of the second half of your tour. In 1 year, the Marines had to do 13 months because they always had to be better than the Army. Was that how that was? Yeah. 13 months for the Marines and 12 months for the Army. So I was on day 1 of the 7th month. And I carried a radio for an officer who was a platoon leader. Our platoon had about 20 guys in it. And the platoon leader was a lieutenant, and he had been in Vietnam about 2 months. I'd been there, this is my beginning of my 7th month. There were guys that had been there in my unit. They came in waves to replenish. And there were guys that had been there for 11 to 11 and a half months. And then there was the guys that had been there 6 months, and there were these guys that were there 2 months. And we all together, we went up into the Asha Valley, and we went up a hill a number of times. There's a film about it. It's called Hamburger Hill. And it was from May 10th through 20th. And it was the largest battle of 1969 as far as casualties on both the Vietnamese and the American side. And it was seen as a microcosm of the war because we fought for 10 days to take this hill, and then a few days later we left. Well, I got wounded on day 8, so I got to have all the emotional baggage of seeing most of my friends killed or wounded, and then get shot myself. And I woke up on day 8, and we were getting mortared. I was up on top of a ridge line. Hamburger Hill was a hill over. I was on the next hill, and there was a sort of what's called a saddle, and then up on another hill. I was on top of this hill, and we got mortared that morning, and I tried to get real small. I used to try to get small when, I'm almost 6'3", but I try to become 4'1" when we get mortared, or 4'1", or maybe 1 inch tall. I try to go underground. I try to get tiny. I try to get really small. Couldn't get small enough. But I didn't get hit, and none of us did. And so our platoon had lost most of the guys the day before. We had been ambushed, and we were talking about medevacs. I did, in fact, call medevacs for people who were wounded. That was one of my jobs. And we medevaced out most of my platoon the day before, or they went out that night because they were killed in a terrible ambush that we had got caught up in. And so that next day, I was given sort of the day off kind of thing, because there weren't enough of us to really do much. And the lieutenant and I were back at what was called the command post, the CP, and it was the middle of a perimeter. The perimeter is this big circle around the top of this hill, and they're all dug in with these bunkers. And I was in a bunker in the middle of this, and I was eating. And a gas canister landed, a CS, it's a tear gas kind of canister, landed in my foxhole with me. If you can imagine, if you were in a foxhole and something landed in it, what would you do? Yeah. You'd get out? Would you have time to get out?
Throw it out?
Throw it out. That's what I did. I picked it up and threw it out. And it burned my fingers. And I remember that. I threw it out, and I thought, well, if that can land in there, anything can land in there. I'm out of here. And at that point, the lieutenant was calling me. So so the air is all full of this tear gas, and there's all these, I can hear all this small arms fire, and there's somebody inside of the perimeter, and I crawl over to the lieutenant, and he said, you better get on the radio. And so we're both laying, there's this huge tree, if you can imagine this right here, is this huge tree, and we're both laying behind it. And I'm on the right. You can tell by my wounds. And when I got hit, I was in firing position with the M16. I have no idea what was happening. I must have seen something. I have no memory. And I have a sense that a North Vietnamese soldier and I shot each other, but I don't know. That's my best sense of what happened. But I had been on the radio, and then and my M16 was bent. All the barrel was all bent up and broken up. Well, why do I know that? Because I stayed awake. I got hit with a rocket-propelled grenade directly. Hit the tree, hit me, and hit the radio. You've seen those now because they use them in this war too. And they're sort of like bazookas, and they have that long front on it. That guy Rambo can catch them and throw them, and they bounce off his chest, that muscular guy in the movies. I was pretty muscular, but not quite as muscular as him. I'll tell you, my first reaction to getting hit was surprise. I remember my first emotion was, it was this huge blast, and my first emotion was, I was just amazed. I was just so surprised that I got wounded, and my head was ringing, and my second reaction was I wanted to protect myself, and my third reaction was I could have moved. And by then, the lieutenant who was laying right next to me was not injured, although he was bounced around. And so I took this thing, it took off my hand, it hit me in the chest, hit me in the stomach, hit me all the way down, about right here is my lowest wound, and hit me in all of my vital organs on my right side. I had a sucking chest wound. It took off the right side of my face, and it took out my orbital rim. And yet I was awake, and the guys tried to keep me awake and tried to help me and tried to. One of the things he didn't want anybody to do when they got wounded is close their eyes and leave. Would you know why you wouldn't want them to do that? Because they would die. And if they died, a piece of us would die. And we could die if somebody else died. And we're all very, very close. Become very, very close in combat. Very close relationships. The reason for fighting for the guys I was with so we could all get back together and in the United States and all survive together and not have our arms and legs blown off. That didn't happen. I was medevaced and I was in a military hospital, and you heard our nurse talk about that within a half hour. Well, it took about 20 minutes to get me out of a raging firefight where they dropped a basket down into the jungle and put me in the basket and pulled me out. They were getting hit. I was getting fired at, and they pulled me out and they took me to an aid station. I was in an aid station about 20, 25 minutes after being wounded. And I was wounded on the Laotian border, up in, way out in the jungle, in the woods. And I was, by the time I got I remember seeing a nurse, and I was really pleased to see a nurse, an American nurse, and after that I went blind. I was blind for about 3 days, and before my eyesight came back from the trauma to my head. I got medevaced after 3 days. I was medevaced up to Japan, to Yokohama, and then I was supposed to be die there. And so my parents came over. To be with me, and my father paid his own way, and my mother was sent over by the Red Cross. And they cared for me, and I did not die, obviously. But I also, I had a long struggle with wounds and with gangrene and with cardiac arrest, heart attack, and went into a coma. Came out of all of that. After about 6 weeks, I was medevaced to the United States, San Francisco, and eventually, through a lot of really good medical care, healed, and I was in the hospital for a year, and then in and out of the hospital for a year. I tell you this story because I think it's part of what we carry, and you read the book, What You Carry. That's what I carry, and I still carry a lot of sadness about war. And I still carry a lot of feelings for people who are lost, and a lot of sadness for war in general. And that's partly why after I got out of graduate school, I wanted to become a college professor. In fact, I had become a teacher, an instructor at a university, and I ended up actually becoming a therapist and working with people who were traumatized. I realized I was on bonus time, and bonus time being that I had been blessed with life twice, once at birth and once at 21 years old. And I was going to do something with my life. And my family were just amazing. My sister was with me every day in San Francisco. My parents were with me in Japan. My wife Lisa is here. Lisa, I wonder if you would just wave or something up there. There. My wife Lisa and I have been together for 36 years. She was at the hospital when I came home to San Francisco on July 4th, 1969. Yeah, I came home on fireworks day. Bad day to bring a vet home, the fireworks day. Not a good day. I appreciate you all listening to our stories, and I hope you can see this, the kind of, I hope by my telling my story, it's really kind of hard for me to do, but I'm really doing this to honor the people who did not make it and the people who are still struggling today with war, both the young people that are in this current war and people that fought on all wars. Thanks.
just make sure that you speak up nice and loud so that everybody around you can hear the question. And maybe stand, please.
I have a question for Mr. Tice. You talked about your friends getting shot and being wounded. And so my question is, how did you manage to cope with emotional and mental pain? And how are you coping with it now?
I had a coping style, and maybe probably you all do have probably developed with like tough things happen in your life, and you have certain styles that you probably use to deal with things. But my coping style then and now, and it worked better in war than it does now, but was to get real busy. And I would really intensely concentrate on my job. Like I'd be on the radio and there'd be gunfire going off, things blowing up and all. I'd be on the radio, I was just busy. I'm sorry, I'm on the phone. You know, I'm busy doing my job. I concentrate on my job. I kept my knife really sharp. My weapon was real clean. Radio was real clean. I was clean in the jungle. Well, sort of clean. Actually, really funky, dirty, but clean. Sort of clean. In other words, I focused a lot on busyness, and I used humor. I used humor with my friends and myself to try to keep away the reality of what was going on around. And that's how I cope. How I cope now is, well, you know, it doesn't work so well as a married person if things are going wrong. Say there's a problem in the family and you get real busy and put a new roof on the house or something, you know, rather than talking to the people in your life. So I think now I'm more likely to talk to the people that are in my life and talk about what's on my mind and how I'm feeling. So it's different. Talking about how you were feeling in combat was not something that was an option. How are you feeling about that? You know, you just didn't, you know, it wasn't part of the deal.
I was wondering, what are some of the parallels that you see between the Vietnam War and the Iraq War now, for either of you, any of you?
Okay, did everybody hear that question?
Well, combat doesn't change. Combat is the same. The environment changes, the weapons change, and all that, but for an infantryman, it's up close and personal. When you're an infantryman, as Steve and I were, the enemy is as close as you are, and you're just punching it out day after day. So that doesn't change. I suppose, although I've not been in this present Iraq war, but my son has. I suppose one of the big differences is the intensity of it, because in World War II, now think of this, in World War II, in the Pacific Theater, you know, Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Okinawa, places like that. The typical American servicemen who fought in the Pacific, in 4 years, probably saw 40 days of combat. Because they would take, say, Iwo Jima, and it might take 2 weeks. And at the end of 2 weeks, you had huge casualties, but the island was secured. So that division, 20,000 soldiers and Marines, would come out and go to New Zealand for a year and train. And then they might go to the next one, like Tarawa or Okinawa. In Vietnam, again, World War II, 4 years, 40 days. The typical infantryman in Vietnam in 1 year fought 240 days. The intensity was huge. And there was no stop from it. Now, in Iraq, it's different for them, and maybe even more difficult because they live a schizophrenic life. Because it might be intense combat for a day, 2 days, and stuff like that. Then they're living in a barracks where they actually have Burger King and internet, and so they're living a real schizophrenic life. We didn't live that way in Vietnam. For us, it was total intensity all the time. In terms of the political parallels, you want to be careful when you start talking about that because remember the adage that every complicated problem has a clear-cut, simple solution that is usually wrong. So don't try to come up with quick similarities or parallels between, say, the war in Vietnam and the war in Iraq. It's much more complicated than that. But for the infantrymen fighting the war, it's the same. For the fighter pilot, it's the same. For the helicopter pilot, it's the same. Same type of process. Again, the equipment changes, but the intensity of the combat still pretty much remains the same.
I'd say that one of the things that Jim was with the Vietnamese people a lot, but when I went to Vietnam, I didn't know anything at all about their culture. And I didn't know anything about who they were or whether they wanted us there or what was going on with them. And I think the same is true of us going to Iraq. I don't think we understand their culture, and I don't think politically we understood it going in, and I don't think the soldiers really understand it now as they go in. And I think that's sad.
I know you said that about around 3% of the people who serve in Vietnam will probably serve there. That 79% include again. And I was wondering why I say that you all have done it. If you could do it again.
I didn't hear the question.
Would you serve again, even after it's happened? Personally, yes, I would, in a heartbeat. It was an amazing experience, but it was also an experience that has impacted the remainder of my life, and probably will for all of my life. Because I served in Vietnam, I was given a tuition exemption, so when I came back to the States and I wanted to go to school in this state, I paid a minimal amount of money to go to school. And so I was married at the time, I had 2 young children, but I was going to school full-time and paying, I think my tuition was $288 a quarter, when my classmates were paying, I don't know, a couple thousand. And so my husband and I talked about it, and he basically said, well, we don't know how long that's going to last, so stay in school as long as you can. So I finished a doctoral degree, and now I teach at Green River Community College and at UW-Tacoma part-time, there and full-time at Green River. My dissertation research was on women who served in Vietnam, and since the completion of that dissertation project, I've been giving talks here, there, and everywhere. I've consulted with playwrights and news reporters and a whole variety of other things. It's really been the foundation, basically, for the way the rest of my life has gone. And I think for Steve, in many respects, that's true as well.
Would I go to war again? Well, I get to stay away from what ifs, because what ifs aren't good for me. And when I was young, I had a lot of those what ifs. What if I had stayed further behind a tree? What if I had gone to help this guy that got shot and that I didn't? And all those what ifs that I carried out of the war really hurt me, and I stay away from them. But I would say this, that I really, that 20-year-old kid that went to Vietnam, 20-year-old young man, I have a lot of respect for him and what he stood up to. And I would not, as a 58-year-old, a 57-year-old man, want to go to a war. But I don't have that kind of hindsight. But I'm really proud of who I was at that age.
I'd do it again. Again, I was a career Marine, so after Vietnam, we went into Beirut, into Panama, Grenada, back to Laos. So for me, that's what I chose to do. And I would do it again in a minute. In fact, if I were a young guy, I would be a Marine again, all over again. Notwithstanding that my younger brother was killed in Vietnam. But I'd do it again.
What are your thoughts on drafting for the war now, the war in Iraq?
Well, listen, I lived at both ends of it, and we should never, ever draft again. The draft doesn't work. It doesn't work. Stay with all volunteer force, best way to go.
What do you believe you were fighting for? Or do you all have a general consensus?
In Vietnam? Did you all hear the question? The question was, what do we think we're fighting for? Well, as a Marine, that was my duty. And I chose, as a Marine officer, I chose to take an oath saying that I would support the orders of the President of the United States and the Constitution of the United States. So when our elected government said that that's what we're going to do, that was my job. Now, I had the choice of not doing that. I could have left the Marine Corps if I chose to, but I was doing it because as a Marine officer, that was my duty to do it. Now, when you're in combat, and Steve talked about this, when you're in combat, you don't think about the Constitution, democracy, or the flag. You think about the people you're with. And the reason you perform on the battlefield is because of those people you're with. And believe me, those people on the battlefield are closer to your family. And the emotional attachment is closer to your family at that time. And you don't want to do anything that would ever let them down. Ever. And I'll just tell you a story that might point this out. Steve mentioned that he was a radio operator, and my radio operator for a while, his name was Steve also. Steve was from Wisconsin, and during the early part, during the war, there's a draft. And if you were a healthy male, you were to be drafted and spend 2 years in the Army. Now, your option was to wait and be drafted, or you could volunteer to be drafted, which meant, say, call my number right away so I can go into my 2 years, or you could join the Army or another branch of the service. If you joined for a longer period of time. So it was not uncommon for a person to volunteer for the draft so they could get posted. This kid, Steve, his last name was Dozeman, volunteered for the draft because when he finished high school, he had 2 goals in mind. He wanted to marry his high school sweetheart and he wanted to take over his family farm. So he thought he'd join the Army and get it over. Steve joined the Army, trained as a radio man, sent to Vietnam, and he was assigned to be my radio operator with this Vietnamese unit. And it was not uncommon in Vietnam for people in intense combat to spend 6 months in an intense combat unit and then 6 months in a rear area. So one night we were in a battle just south of Quang Tri City that was very intense. In fact, it was hand-to-hand combat that night. It was that close. And by our first flight, we had taken the objective. And my orders were to stay there until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The helicopter was going to come in and take us back to the Ashall, and then another unit would come and replace us. So after the battle, you were taken for your medevacs, and then you're cleaning your gear, cleaning your weapons, and getting reorganized, and getting some rest if you can before you move on again. So about 9 o'clock that morning, I was cleaning my weapon, and Steve was sitting across from me, and he was working on his gear also. And I realized that young 19-year-old kid had seen more combat than any teenager should see. I decided then to have him transferred back to our unit. So I did. It was in October. Moved forward, and then the Tet Offensive hit. And I went to Place City where Steve was. Now, in the meantime, from the time Steve left me until then, he was working at that headquarters in Play. And radio operators are always in the radio. Radio is never turned off. So at nighttime, my radio operator and I would switch off and on. So we could both get some sleep at different times. So I'd talk to Steve occasionally at night if I'd do a radio check, and he would be on a radio, and occasionally he'd send me something out on a helicopter, maybe because in the Vietnamese, we didn't get resupply of food. We lived off the land. So he might send me a care package. The Tet Offensive hits in Hue City, and it's unbelievable. And the only unit in the city was mine, the Vietnamese unit. But at this kind of administrative headquarters where Steve was, they had a lot of office people and stuff like that. So I found a Marine lieutenant and an Army lieutenant. I told both of them to find all the soldiers and Marines they could find, form them into a fighting unit, and meet me back in 1 hour, ready to go to war. So 1 hour goes by, they come back, and I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. I have no idea how big the enemy is. I have no idea how long it's going to take to get U.S. reinforcements in here. So we're going to go right at the enemy. I'm going to go right at right at their throat. So we're going to attack right up the middle. We're not stopping for anything. If you have casualties, let them stay there. We'll have trucks behind us, pick them up, and move them out. So Steve came to me, and he said, I'm going to go with you. I said, no, Steve, look. You're going home in about 10 days. You've done your duty. And I have no idea what this means for us the next couple of days, but I know there's a lot of casualties. He said to me, look, you've just picked up two new units. You've got a new radio operator. You need me to go with you. Now, a radio operator thinks as the commander thinks. Steve could think for me. For example, if we were in a heavy combat, I might turn to Steve and say, Steve, I need some fighter planes in right now. Steve would say, the fighters are 50 miles up. Florida, waiting for you to call them in. If I was taking casualties, I'd say to Steve, I need medevacs. He'd say, medevacs are on the way in. He could think for me. He said, you need me. I said, fine. Okay, come with me. We started about 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning. Moved very fast. About mid-afternoon, Steve went down, and he was maybe 10 meters away from me. I went over and I pulled him to a defilade position so he'd be covered from enemy fire. He was seriously wounded. I gave him 2 shots of morphine, put a tourniquet on, and I have my hand on his chest. And I said, now, Steve, we're going to get you out of here, but I got to go. But I said, when I come home, I'm going to come see you. Before I could leave, he put his hand on top of my hand. And he said 2 things to me. The first thing he said was personal. The next thing he said, now this is important. The next thing he said, which I believe was the last thing he ever said, was take care of our guys. Now, Steve died on the medevac helicopter. But that's, when you're in combat, that's what you do. And you do it because of the guys you're with. Now, we obviously need women with us in our infantry units. But you fight because you don't want to let them down. And Steve's last thought was of the other guys that were with us. So for people in combat, the real driver on a day-to-day basis are the people you're with. And in terms of how do you cope with that in combat, at least for me, it was not an issue. It is now. For example, a day still goes by that I don't think of Steve.
Jacob, when you first got your first call, like your first academy coming in, were you scared?
You bet. I was terrified. We had, irrespective of how good your nursing education was, there was no way you could be prepared to see what you saw. There was, even women who trained in some of the worst medical areas in the country, Cook County in Chicago, Bellevue in New York, South Central LA hospitals, had never seen the kinds of wounds and injuries that we were seeing. I mean, there's no way that we could have been adequately prepared to see what we saw. So yeah, I was terrified. I was terrified that I would not have the ability to do well, that I could not do my job. And quite frankly, there are patients that I remember to this day who, this is part of what I call the nursing guilt, who I still believe that maybe if I had been better, maybe if I had noticed this symptom earlier, maybe if I had been sharper on that day, they might still be alive. Those feelings don't ever go away. And there's not a day goes by that I don't think of some of those guys. Now, we were kind of like Steve's platoon. We always had new people coming into the hospital, and we had experienced people leaving. So that meant that we were always teaching people how to get over this massive culture shock, if you will, of trying to deal with 40 patients whose injuries would all land them in Harborview's intensive care unit. But we have a ward of 40 of them, and they're not in the intensive care unit. And so you can imagine then the severity of the wounded that we treated in the ICU. There was this very quick learning curve, and we did become very good at what we did. But you had to, because people's lives depended on it. And so there weren't too many nurses that I worked with. In fact, I can only think of one, and she was She went home early because she was on her second tour and she was not psychologically healthy. Let's just put it that way. She's the only nurse I can think of that I would not have entrusted my life to, because we were with our patients 12 hours a day. We knew our patients better than the physicians knew their patients, because they only saw them once or twice a day to make rounds. And we were with them 12 hours a day. So we learned very quickly how to do a really good job. And that is only a small part of why the survival rate was so high. Just one small part. But yeah, I was scared.
I was going to say, this was for the nurse, I forgot your name, but what was your most traumatic injury that you had to deal with?
There's a saying that I oftentimes mention, and I don't know where it comes from. I think it's my own. The nightmares belong to the veterans, and I'm not going to tell you what my most traumatic patient was. Sorry.
Sorry in advance if I have some of my facts wrong, but this is kind of a long question, and any of you can answer. How do you feel about the timing of the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam? What was it like to know about the North Vietnamese taking Saigon and President Thien's last message to his people announcing the end of U.S. support?
John, I don't think everybody heard that. Like do one part at a time, maybe.
It was well formulated.
How do you feel about the timing of the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam? What was it like to know about the North Vietnamese taking Saigon and President Thien's last message to his people announcing the end of U.S. support?
Well, first of all, we should have pulled out earlier, because we had no intentions of winning that war, ever. And had we had intentions of winning the war, we could have won that war quite easily. And I'll give you two examples. In about 1971, the peace talks were going on, and they stalled. President Nixon told the North Vietnamese, if you don't come back to the talks, I'm going to close Haiphong Harbor. He did. And he said, if you don't, after this, I'm going to take out the hydroelectric dams up along the China border. They believed it. The talks continued. So had we done something differently, we would have won that war. For me, the turning point in the war came on March 31st of 1968, which is my birthday, by the way. The Tet Offensive had just ended. And during the Tet Offensive, the North Vietnamese lost everything. And they had taken the materials on the Ho Chi Minh Trail during the monsoon season, because, of course, we had cloud coverage and our aircraft couldn't get it. When the offensive finished, the skies were clear, which meant that if they tried to come down the trail, it would obviously interdict them. I was convinced, absolutely convinced, that because of what they did during the Tet Offensive, particularly in the city of Hue, which is a kind of a separate story that takes a little bit of time, but the fact that they violated Hue, I was convinced that we were going to get serious and go north. Hue City is about 35 kilometers south of the demilitarized zone. And again, I was with the Vietnamese at that time. On the 31st of March, the President, Johnson, was having a news conference. And I told my Vietnamese unit that he was going to announce that we were going to go north and finally invade North Vietnam. And I further told my unit that we were going to go first because the Vietnamese would lead the attack, and our unit was going to go in first. Well, the President had his news conference, and not only did not say that, he also said we were not going to bomb north of the 21st parallel, which meant to the North Vietnamese, you're welcome to do it again. Steve mentioned earlier that they took several hills in the Ashall more than once. At that moment, I realized we had no intentions of winning that war, none. And I believed at that time we should have started pulling out then, because we had no intentions of winning that war. Had we had intentions of winning the war, it would have been quite easy to do it. Now, in terms of Saigon falling, I think any of us, or maybe not any of us, but certainly for me and people I knew, it was very distressing, because when we pulled out, there's an agreement that there would be a peaceful reunification of North and South, and of course there was not. It perhaps is more painful for me because I was with the Vietnamese. And I believe that the American people, the American government, treated the Vietnamese very badly. The typical American military person in Vietnam had pejorative thoughts of the Vietnamese military. And the reason they did is there were three levels of armed forces in Vietnam. You had what they called popular forces. Popular forces would be a guy who ran a shoemaker shop during the day, and at night he got his musket and stood out the crossroads of the road. Then they had regional forces, which would be kind of akin to a national guard, but not as sophisticated. Then they had the regular army. The regular army was always out fighting, and that's who I was with. The regional forces and the popular forces, those guys carrying that rifle at night, that's whom the American military saw as they were driving through the villages on trucks. They would see these ragtag military people there and make the assumption that was the Vietnamese army. The Vietnamese army was out fighting the war. I believe the American government used the Vietnamese people and government badly because we convinced them that fighting this war is a good deal. It'd be good for them. It was not good for them. And we did not hold up our end of the bargain, which we could have done. So I felt very badly about the fall of Vietnam, or fall of Saigon. And I still have some very, very good friends, very close friends, Vietnamese military people. As a matter of fact, the weekend after next in Seattle will be the Vietnamese Armed Forces Day. So the Vietnamese military, who happen to live on the West Coast, will have a 2-day celebration in Seattle, kind of like our Armed Forces Day. And I'm proud to tell you that I'll be there for both those days, taking part with them.
This question is kind of for all of you. Have you ever, or given a chance, would you now return to Vietnam?
Would you go back to Vietnam for a visit?
Oh, no.
So go ahead.
No. Not because the Vietnamese people liked us, unlike what's going on in Iraq. They liked us, and they treated us well, and the Vietnamese people I've met since have treated me very well and have been very thankful to me for my sacrifices that I made. I'm talking about people with South Vietnamese, the communists, and our soldiers and the communists, I think, have made peace as well. But I'm talking about the South Vietnamese people were kind to us and cared about us, and I think still do. I would not go just simply because I don't have very good health. And I would not go because that would be I won't leave the country.
I thought about going, and I had an opportunity to take a group of students at one point. I think it would be really difficult for me to go back and see what has happened to my hospital and areas that I have fond memories of. I'm not planning on it. I have other places I would rather go. I want to keep those memories intact. I know one of the hospitals on the base where I was at, there's now an orchard, and that's a nice thought, but I'm not planning on going.
I would go back, but not for any psychological reasons. I've been there quite a bit. I've seen everything I need to see. I don't care for the food. The weather's not that good. And it's about a 20-hour plane ride. So if I'm going to take a 20-hour plane ride, it's going to be someplace that I wish to go to. Obviously, I've had plenty of chances to go back. I've chosen not to go. I just digress a tiny bit here, but I mentioned that I had 4 counterparts, and the last one was there when I left. And in 1971, the Vietnamese were going to go to Laos. And the peace talks were going on at the time, and the President of the United States decided that the advisors should not go with them because it might be provocative to the peace talks. So the advisors had to stop at the border, and the Vietnamese were mauled badly because the advisors control all the firepower and things like that, which is another example of why we didn't take good care of the Vietnamese, because if we were good advisors, we would have taught them to live without us, but we didn't do it. Anyhow, this particular guy was my last counterpart. He goes into this, and the first report we got back was that he was killed. And then we started getting reports back that he had actually been wounded and was a prisoner of war. Well, the guy who was his last advisor, the guy left him at the border, happened to be a Marine also, felt terribly about that. And then later on, when he was in station in Washington, D.C., he had this guy's picture. We call him Harry. His name was Hui, H-U-E. And he showed this picture to all the Vietnamese military he would see in Washington, because many of them went there after the war to start a new life. One day, he showed the picture to a guy, and the guy said, yeah, it's my cousin. And he was wounded in Laos, spent 13 years as a prisoner of war in Hanoi, the same camps that Senator McCain was in, places like that. They cut off all of his fingers on his left hand, and he said now he's a political prisoner in Saigon. So we have a group of those of us who are advisors, and our task was to get those guys out. And we have most of them out now. Anyhow, we got this guy out, and on November 11th of 1991, he arrived in the United States, and doing very well. Anyhow, he and I are very close, so we correspond. In fact, I had 2 meals with him today, and we talk quite a bit. And one day, a few years ago, he called me and said, Jim, I have 2 favors to ask of you. I said, okay, what are they? He said, the first one is I'm getting my citizenship. And when I do, I want you to be there. I said, of course I'll be there. He said, the second one is, when I get my citizenship, I can get a passport. Then I want to go back to Vietnam, because the Vietnamese, for the most part, are Buddhist. And the Buddhists have a different concept of life and death. Like we think of life and death as 2 separate events. For the Buddhists, it's sort of a continuation of one to the other. And the death and burial is a very significant part for families and all that. Well, his parents died when he was in the prisoner of war camp, and they were buried in Hue. But the North Vietnamese would not let this guy go to Hue because they were afraid that he might cause an insurrection or something like that. So he said, when I get my passport, I want to go back to visit my parents' grave, and I want you to come with me. I said, Harry, look, I think it's important that you go back to visit your parents' grave, but I'm not going to go with you. So, unless my wife has other plans and wanted to go there sometime, I don't think I'll go.
I want to add something to that. Actually, the question was, this is, those of you that maybe lost track of which question we're on the one, will we go back to Vietnam right now? And in 1989, well, actually, I had a chance to go a couple of different times as a therapist with veterans to Vietnam, but I chose, again, just for health reasons, not to go. But for some reason, in 1989, the 20th anniversary of my wounding, I went to the Soviet Union. I went to Russia. I was wounded by a Russian weapon, and I felt like they had been in a war in Afghanistan, and they had young soldiers there that had post-traumatic stress disorder, and they wanted to set up a clinic for post-traumatic stress disorder. I went over there with a group of veterans who were also therapists and helped the Moscow State University set up a PTSD program and actually did hands-on work with people with post-traumatic stress disorder that were Russian veterans who had been wounded by American weapons. And I had been wounded as an American by Russian-made weapons. It was really our war between America and Russia and communism from the 50s and 60s. And so part of my peacemaking for myself was to go to Russia, to Moscow, and do that work. So I did do something of what you're trying to talk about, but actually to go into, and I actually got ill. And it took me quite a while to get well. I have a lot of physical problems, so it's hard for me to travel like that, but I did do that. So there was the need to do something like that I had inside of me. I just wanted to add that.
Despite whatever political ideals you possessed at the time of Vietnam, do you all feel like your individual efforts, despite on top of just staying alive, do you feel that those efforts as an individual contributed to the greater good of whatever you felt you were there for, more than just you staying alive?
I did, yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And the greater good meaning there's nothing really good about war, and I really hope that humankind at some point will find other ways to resolve differences between nations in this world and show responsible leadership all over the world. But as far as I have a lot of pride in the fact that I did my job well, even though I didn't want to be there. That's real hard to do when you don't want to be somewhere, you don't believe in the political part. But again, I even know World War II veterans that when it came down to the nitty-gritty, what Jim and I have talked about, what we've talked about here today, is that you end up fighting to keep each other alive no matter what. And I have great pride in the care that we gave to each other, and that's about the best way I can answer that. If you see the film Private Ryan, there's a scene in there where they're all talking about why they're there, and I remember one person said that they keep getting further and further away from home, and they weren't talking about geography. You psychologically and emotionally, you move away from everything that you were, and you never be that again. But you can be something different, and you can find goodness in your heart out of the worst kinds of situations. And part of that is what we're doing in front of you right now. This is not easy for any of us.
Let me just kind of follow a tiny bit on that if I can, and this is kind of an editorial comment, so take it for that. It's my turn to ask a question, I guess, and make a comment. First of all, I've been in combat under Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, and I didn't notice any difference. So don't worry about the politics. But I had to testify one time before a subcommittee in Washington, and the kind of theme of what they were going at was, were we Marines, particularly, too aggressive? And I said, well, first of all, your job in the Congress should be to never call us. Because if you call us, that means you, the leadership of this country, has failed. And now you're asking somebody else to bail you out. And you have this notion that you can have this nice war. It doesn't happen. War is nasty. I said, now let me tell you, I'm talking to this group in Washington, do your job well, because you call me, you're not calling Meals on Wheels. We're gunfighters. We're good at it. And if you call me, it's because you failed, and you're going to ask us to do something for you. And I'm going to do it. But in the process, I'm going to take my Marines home. So I'm going to shooting. And it's going to be nasty. So don't call me. Do your job well. And make sure that as the leaders of this country, you do your job so well that you never have to call on the military to go to war for you. Because if you do, nobody's going to be happy. Nobody's going to be happy. Because the outcome of war is not pleasant under any circumstances.
I think from my perspective, I will add a little bit to that, because I was in a very different setting where we had the perception of being safe. We never were. There were snipers who came into the hospital. Hospitals got mortared. We weren't safe. We had the perception of being safe. But we formed relationships in that hospital setting akin to relationships that are formed by people who are fighting with one another to keep each other alive. The closest relationship I have is with a nurse that was with me for all but 1 week of my tour. But what we saw in our patients was a commonality of humanity. We experienced a life very different than anything we'd ever experienced before, because quite frankly, in the hospital setting where we were, nobody cared about who your daddy was or what side of the tracks you grew up on or what school you went to, whether it was Peninsula or Gig Harbor, and all of the petty arguments about, well, I want to see this movie this night and I don't want to do this. Those things were absolutely, totally meaningless. We used to call this place the world. We used to call the United States the world. But the real world was the day-to-day life and death that we experienced in Vietnam. That was reality. And under those circumstances, you get to know people at a very raw and a very deep level, such that religion and age and rank and skin color and all of those kinds of cultural, social trappings that we think to be important are totally meaningless. we're all in it together, and quite frankly, when the blood runs together, you can't tell who's black, white, Jewish, Catholic, Baptist, or whatever. And so you have a very different perspective on life when you look at the frailty of life itself and the common humanity that you share, irrespective of nationality and all of those other things that we deem to be important. It's a very different perspective on the world that is invaluable, but unfortunately it takes oftentimes an extremely intense situation like that to come to that understanding and to realize what it really means.
Yeah, I just want to add something too. I was really touched by that, what my friend has said here, you know. Both friends have said, and you know, and I'm also thinking to myself about war. And war, during war, some of the most humane acts I've ever seen of people who putting themselves in harm's way to save another. Those guys that were in that helicopter hovering above that firefight, getting shot at to pull me out of there, and I was almost dead, who to save me did that. That's an act of enlightenment. They put themselves in harm's way to save another person. And I saw that over and over again. The worst things I've ever seen in my life were in war, and the most incredible, humane, the nurses, the medics that took care of me from the field all the way through, and the people that still take care of me today medically, have been wonderful. And the people that I met were incredible in the conditions, the awful conditions that we were in. And so war brings out, we got to figure out another way to have those kinds of experiences.
There was a young man on my ward who, and I'm not exaggerating, he had a hole in his back this big. And he was a great anatomy lesson because none of the wounds were ever closed in surgery, because his kind of wound was going to need plastic surgery and skin grafts for many years to come. But he had a hole this big in his back and he could hardly move. But every morning he would roll over on his side and he would use every ounce of his strength to pull himself out of bed. And then he would go from bed to bed for the guys who couldn't get out of bed, and he would get them fresh water, or he'd help feed them their breakfast, or he'd empty their urinals. He could hardly move himself, and yet his first thought was taking care of the other guys and doing things that he knew for us was kind of busy work, because we had wounds to irrigate, we had pain medications to give, we had intravenous lines to start, we had wounds to clean, and so we had a lot of serious tasks to do, and so he did what he could do, even though he could hardly move himself. That kind of depth of caring you don't see on a day-to-day basis in our everyday lives. He didn't know any of those guys.
Yeah, and that's what makes it kind of difficult. You know, what Marianne was talking about, that makes it difficult when you're around pettiness, and why many times veterans are a little have a little difficulty with some of the pettiness that happens in regular life, because we have seen, or on the job or whatever, we have seen so much, and it's really hard to. You know, I worked in the VA for years, and it's a huge bureaucracy, and, you know, I was the only combat wounded vet that was at a high level of management. It was tough. It was tough. Yeah, go ahead, Becky.
How does morality function in the advancement of war? Like, how did morality contribute beneficially, and in what way was it a barrier?
Well,
War is not moral.
for me, my morality is to, under all circumstances, no matter when or where, to do good and avoid evil. And that's my criteria for it. And if I was doing what I considered good, then fine. I cannot imagine a situation or circumstances that, in peace or war, that I would choose to do evil. I just would do it. So that's my criteria for it.
I think it's difficult to assess where the line is, especially in wartime, and that's why we have things like Geneva Conventions, which were routinely abrogated in Vietnam. Some of my worst memories are patients who came in to me because a toddler had been sent to play with some GIs, The GIs loved the Vietnamese children. They were cute. They loved the GIs. Here, these gigantic men. Of course, these gigantic women who were American nurses were terrifying to these little kids because Vietnamese women don't grow as big as we were. And so we wanted to play with the little kids, and they ran from us. They were terrified of us. But they would strap explosive devices on the bodies of these toddlers and then send them in to play with the GIs and then explode this child. That, to me, is immoral. I mean, it goes against everything that I perceive humanity to be about, and that's something that I cannot reconcile even to this day. And I can understand people giving comfort and aid to the enemy at night so that they don't get killed. They're protecting their families even though they're our allies during the daytime. There's a lot about wartime psychology and behavior that I can understand. It's those kinds of things I pray I never have the capability of rationalizing or understanding. It's that immorality, even in the face of the immorality of warfare, that I cannot understand.
I think there's a line you set, and you set a line for yourself, and you set the people that you're with, you set a line. And I was lucky enough to be with a discipline unit in the 101st Airborne Division, and there was disciplinary unit in our leadership, and you have to set a line. I saw people cross that line, and they were ostracized. You set a line, it's a different line than we have out here every day, or at least most of us, depending on where you live, to fight in a war, but there's a line that you don't cross.
How do you feel about movies like Forrest Gump that have scenes about Vietnam War in it, and how they depict those scenes?
Interesting you would choose that movie.
I choose not to see movies about combat, particularly. So I've not seen them.
I've seen a few, but my reference point is obviously not combat. Needless to say, there is virtually no representative view of what happens in military hospitals in combat zones.
I've never seen one. But I would say this about films in general, too. It's really hard for me to watch the films because I got my own film. And I actually felt the need to several times because I was working as a counselor and the vets wanted to go see a film and I sometimes would go with them. Or when the film Hamburger Hill came out in the 80s, I think it was the 80s, and Lisa and I went with some vets. You know, I remember we walked up and here's this marquee and it says Hamburger Hill. And I think, ooh, how weird. How weird. Hamburger Hill. I'm going in to see this. And I sat in there and I was watching the film. And it's not really a very good film, but the combat was really realistic. And I just kind of went inside of my own head and I thought, I don't want to do this. So I tend to avoid them, although I've seen a few, but I tend to avoid them. Got them already going on in my head.
I know, Mr. Tice, you had mentioned that sometimes people get further and further away from home. How was it adjusting when you did get home to the States? What was it like and how difficult was that for you? Well, all of you, actually.
Well, I could start by saying I got married and had a child, and I thought that I put it behind me. I thought that because I had overcome my physical wounds that I'd be all right, but I had all these nightmares, and I really struggled with problems with anger and with alcohol to treat myself, and I ended up being one of the lucky people because I got into a counseling program. That there were very few counseling programs in the 1970s for vets that were realistic, and I was lucky and got to go through that and pull my life back together. But for me, it was very difficult to return. Somebody asked about the tanks coming in Saigon and with the fall of Saigon. That surprised me. I thought I had put everything away and hidden it, and I had nothing going on, and that night I had a terrible, terrible experience. And that war just came right back in front of me, and it surprised the heck out of me. So I was lucky, and I went through counseling myself, and I became a therapist, and I've worked hard at my own issues around war and others, but it's been difficult.
Coming home for me, there was an expectation just to go back to your life as normal. It's as if you had been to Seattle for the weekend. My sister met me at the plane, and before the hellos, welcome homes, or anything, it was, well, when are you going to get a job? Because I was now out of the military, and quite frankly, I was angry at the pettiness that I saw in people that I thought were friends. I was exceedingly impatient with, the day-to-day life. People weren't addressing issues that were of importance to me. I went to work and I was bored silly. As a nurse in the intensive care unit at Tacoma General, I was actually quite bored. I later trained as a nurse practitioner, and I went back to school and had children, but I found that when I came back that people were not interested in what I had to say. I was very proud of what I had done in Vietnam. Part of that because I was from a military family and I grew up in a military environment where people were very supportive. Now I was in a civilian environment where people said to me, "Oh gee, a hospital in Vietnam, was that just like MASH?" And then before I could open my mouth to respond to them, they turned around and left. Nobody wanted to hear. And so I learned, as many of us did, to shut your mouth. You don't talk about it even to your family. In fact, many of you know more about my experiences in Vietnam than my husband does. I still don't talk much about it to many people. And so it was one of those things that, like Steve, I got busy and tried to put behind me. But I too went to a therapy group, and I wrote my first research on that group, and that developed into my doctoral dissertation, which has gone all over the country to vet centers, because until that time, there had been no studies, none, zero at all, about women veterans and what their issues were. Mine was the first one that was done that was of any substantial consequence.
Well, again, I mentioned earlier, be careful not to generalize, because we've all had different experiences. But you hear about how Vietnam vets are treated when they come home. I was never treated rudely or badly by anybody when I come home. The first and third time I came back, I was on a military base, so you're pretty well protected. The second time, which was the most intense time, in 1968, I was transferred to San Francisco. And San Francisco was sort of the real hotbed of the anti-war movement. Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco State University. And
Waterman Hospital.
Yeah, right. And the Marine Corps uniform was a very distinct uniform. And so I was out in public all the time, did a lot of presentations and just all the things in my regular job. I lived in a civilian community, and not once was I ever treated with any level of disrespect or anything of that sort. Now, in terms of the coming home, probably the group that has been the least mentioned, but probably the most impacted by the war, were the families of the service personnel in Vietnam. The difficulty for them was huge, and I'll just use my family as an example. When I was in Vietnam at that time, our two children were small. Our son, about a year and a half, and our daughter about 3 years old. And when I was prior to going to Vietnam at that time, I was stationed in Virginia, but I knew that I was going to go as an advisor, and those of us who were going as advisors, you went through advisory training, then you went back to your regular unit, and then when they needed you, like when somebody was wounded or killed, you got a phone call, and you knew you had 10 days, and you got that phone call to be on your way to Vietnam. So my wife and I decided that it'd be best if my wife and the two children moved to Southern California and lived outside of a large base called Camp Pendleton, which is north of San Diego, south of Los Angeles, because there'd be a lot of other women in the same situation. So we lived in a community contiguous to the base, civilian community. And the only men who were there were those men who were going to Vietnam, just got back from Vietnam, or were recuperating from wounds in Vietnam. And in the Marine Corps, anytime a Marine, any rank, is wounded or injured, an officer personally goes to the family to notify them. If the Marine is killed, not only does an officer go, but a chaplain goes. Well, the day the Tet Offensive started, a lot of casualties. So a Marine Corps car pulled up and stopped in front of our house. So everybody knew that I had been wounded. That night, our 17-month-old son had emergency brain surgery. And when the doctor talked to my wife prior to the surgery, the doctor said, I can't guarantee you anything. But he said, this surgery is going to take at least 8 hours if your son lives. And then if your son does live, I can't guarantee you anything. My son survived, but for the first week he was blind, paralyzed. So you think of the stress that, in this case, my family went through, but my family was just an example of many, many other families. So the difficult part of us being away was the impact on our families. And then sometimes when the service person comes back, there's an adjustment period in there. But when you think of the people who made sacrifices during the war, do not forget the sacrifices that the families made, whose friends, boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, wives, aunts, uncles, or whatever, were in Vietnam. Because those families made a huge sacrifice.
And still do, by the way. You know, I still have a lot of physical problems related to my wounds, and as I age, they get worse. And my wife takes incredibly good care of me. My family was there for me from the beginning. Now, talk about how people treat us when we got back. I thought, because of my wounds and the visual part of looking at me and knowing that I was badly wounded, a lot of people just sort of avoided me, and some people still do. And it's a little difficult for them to face someone that has gone through what I've gone through. And I understand that. And I'm really appreciative for all of us of how attentive you've all been and how you've been here with us, and I just want to say that. But I also want to say that the people who were treated me, American public, did me wrong. They did me wrong because they ignored me. I didn't have anybody do anything really weird like spit on me or anything, because I wouldn't have stood for that. And I don't know if anybody would have done that, they would have been harmed. But I will say this, they ignored me. They ignored me. And that hurt. And it still hurts. But the people who did not were people in my family, and particularly the World War II veterans of my family, treating me with the utmost dignity and respect. And I really appreciate that. And that's the answer to that.
And on that note, our time is up. Please give these folks a
I want to lose both.